The tailor shop was so small most people walked past it without ever noticing. A faded sign, a cracked glass window. Inside, the hum of an old sewing machine mixed with the quiet patience of someone who had learned long ago not to expect much from the world. Grace Thompson bent over the counter, her fingers steady despite the ache in her wrists. The suit laid before her was unmistakable. Italian fabric hand-stitched lining, the kind of cloth meant for boardrooms and private jets. It didn't belong here. Not in a shop where the lights flickered and rent notices were taped beside framed photos of a man who once stitched with pride and died with nothing. The man who wore the suit stood near the door, tall, polished, impatient. A billionaire used to solutions appearing on command. His voice carried the casual authority of someone who had never been told no. "I need this fixed. Tonight," he said, glancing at his watch as if time itself owed him respect. Grace examined the tear carefully. One clean cut, intentional, sabotage, her breath tightened. She knew exactly how hard this would be to repair and exactly how much it should cost. She named the price. The man scoffed, he always did, then something unexpected happened. Grace shook her head. "No," she said quietly, "I won't charge you." The room fell still. The billionaire stared at her, confused now, almost suspicious. People never gave him things for free, not without wanting something back, not without an angle. Grace didn't explain, she didn't smile. She simply turned back to her machine and began to sew. Hours later, the suit was flawless, better than before. The billionaire slipped it on, adjusted his cuffs, and nodded once, already halfway gone in his mind. He dropped a card on the counter and walked out, assuming this was just another small kindness swallowed by a big world. Grace watched him leave, unaware that her hands were trembling. She locked up the shop that night believing it was over. Just another invisible sacrifice. Just another good deed that would disappear without consequence. But the next morning, before she could even lift the metal shutter, 3 black cars stopped in front of her shop. Men in tailored suits stepped out, legal briefcases in hand. And as Grace stood frozen on the sidewalk, one thought echoed in her mind. What she didn't know was that fixing that suit had just put her life under a microscope, and nothing would ever be the same again. Grace Thompson had been born into fabric and thread. Some people inherited houses, some inherited money. Grace inherited a pair of scissors worn smooth by decades of honest work and hands trained to fix what the world tore apart. Her shop sat on the edge of a neighborhood that no longer wanted to remember people like her. New glass buildings rose a block away, reflecting sunlight like they had something to prove. Coffee shops with names no one could pronounce replaced corner stores that once knew everyone by name. And right in between all of it stood Grace's tailor shop, unchanged, stubborn, and quietly surviving. Inside, time moved slower. The walls were lined with yellowed photographs, her father standing proudly beside men in pressed suits, his measuring tape hanging like a badge of honor. He had been a master tailor, too. During a time when black excellence had to work twice as hard just to be acknowledged, he stitched dignity into every garment he touched. He believed clothes weren't just fabric, they were armor. Grace believed that once, too. But belief doesn't pay rent. Every morning followed the same ritual. She unlocked the door before sunrise, swept the same cracked floor, powered on machines that groaned like they might give up any day now. Customers trickled in less and less. Some smiled politely and asked for discounts before even asking for repairs. Others walked in, looked around, and walked right back out, deciding her shop did fit the image they wanted. The landlord's notices stacked up beneath the register. Red ink, final warnings, polite threats disguised as business language. He wanted the space. Developers wanted the land, and Grace was the last loose thread they needed to cut. Yet she stayed. Not because it was profitable, but because it was hers. Grace never married, never had children. The shop had become both. When her father died, buried without headlines or recognition, she promised she wouldn't let his legacy vanish quietly. Even if the world refused to see her, she would see herself. Still, there were nights she sat alone in the shop long after closing. Lights off, listening to the city hum outside and wondering how much longer pride could feed her. The morning the billionaire walked in, she was already tired. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes, but the kind that settles into your bones when you've been strong for too long without anyone noticing. He didn't introduce himself, didn't need to. His confidence did the talking. His watch cost more than her sewing machines combined. When he looked at her, it wasn't cruel, but it wasn't curious either. It was the look of someone scanning a problem, not a person. Grace noticed everything. She noticed how carefully his suit was made, how the fabric caught the light, how the tear didn't match the wear of the rest of the garment. Someone had wanted this suit ruined and fast. As she worked, her mind drifted back to a memory she rarely allowed herself. Her father at the same counter, teaching her how to repair invisible damage. Anyone can sew a rip, he used to say, but fixing something without leaving a scar, that's respect. Grace had learned that lesson well. Her life had left plenty of scars. Years ago, she'd tried expanding the business, applied for loans, promised growth. The banks smiled and declined. She watched tailors with less skill but better connections open shops overnight. She learned the unspoken rules. Talent wasn't enough. Hard work wasn't enough. Not when the system decided who was allowed to rise. That was the quiet injustice Grace lived with. Not loud hatred, but polite dismissal. So when the billionaire stood there, waiting, expecting to pay his way out of inconvenience, something in Grace paused. She saw more than a rich man in a hurry. She saw a moment, a test she didn't ask for. Charging him would have helped her. Covered rent, bought groceries, fixed machines, but it would have meant nothing to him. Another receipt. Another transaction erased by privilege. Fixing the suit for free wasn't charity. It was a statement. It was Grace choosing to honor her craft the way her father taught her, without bending her dignity for money, without shrinking herself to fit expectations. She didn't explain because she didn't owe him an explanation. After he left, card abandoned on the counter like a tip to a street performer, Grace felt the weight of what she'd done settle in. Not pride, not regret, just exhaustion. She closed the shop that night unaware that her quiet decision, made in a room no one respected, had brushed against forces far larger than her life. She thought she had fixed a suit. She didn't yet know she had stepped into a world where kindness was dangerous, truth was inconvenient, and poor black women were never expected to be the ones holding it together. And the system does not like surprises. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No thunder, no warning, just the slow scrape of metal as Grace lifted the shop's shutter, the familiar resistance reminding her how long it had been since anything in her life moved smoothly. The air smelled like dust and rain-soaked concrete, a normal morning, the kind she had survived thousands of times. Until she saw the cars. 3 of them, long, black, polished to a mirror shine that reflected her small shop back at itself. They were parked too neatly, too deliberately, like they had rehearsed where to stop. The street, usually loud with delivery trucks and distant sirens, felt unnaturally still. Grace froze with the shutter halfway raised. Her first thought wasn't fear, it was confusion. No one with cars like that ever came here. She stepped fully onto the sidewalk, the bell above the door clinking softly behind her. That sound, so small, so familiar, felt suddenly out of place, like a whisper in a room full of power. The driver's door of the first car opened. Then another's. Men stepped out, 3 of them, all in dark suits cut with precision she recognized instantly. Not fashion suits, legal suits, the kind worn by people who never raised their voices because they didn't need to. One of them adjusted his cufflinks, another checked a tablet, the third looked straight at her. "Grace Thompson," he asked. He said her name like it was already written down somewhere important. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady out of habit, not comfort. "We'd like to speak with you." Grace glanced up and down the street. A few shop owners watched from doorways. Someone across the road pretended to rearrange fruit while clearly listening. No one intervened. No one ever did. "About what?" Grace asked. The man didn't answer immediately. He looked past her into the shop. His eyes moved quickly, cataloging the space. Old machines, thread racks, the framed photographs, the red notices beneath the register. "May we come in?" he said. It wasn't a question. Inside, the shop felt smaller with them in it. Their presence bent the air. Grace stood behind the counter, instinctively placing her hands flat on the wood like she needed to remind herself she was still standing. "My name is Daniel Roth," the first man said, placing a leather folder on the counter. "I represent Mr. Jonathan Hale." The name landed heavier than expected. Grace knew it now. She had heard it on the radio, seen it in newspapers left behind on buses. Billionaire investor, tech acquisitions, quiet philanthropy paired with ruthless efficiency. The suit. Her stomach tightened. Yes, she said slowly, I repaired his suit. The men exchanged a glance, subtle, practiced. For free, Daniel added. Grace lifted her chin. Yes. There it was, the moment, the shift. Daniel opened the folder. Inside were photographs, close-ups, the suit before and after, the tear, the stitching, her stitching. Her hands curled slightly. We have a few concerns, Daniel said. Concerns? Not thanks, not curiosity. Concerns? You see, another lawyer spoke now, younger, sharper. That suit was evidence. Grace blinked. Evidence of what? A breach, the third man said. He hadn't spoken yet. His voice was lower, slower. Corporate sabotage. The word echoed in the room. Grace looked down at the photographs again. She had known the tear was intentional. She had felt it in the fabric. But evidence. I didn't know, she said honestly. I was asked to fix a suit. And you did, Daniel replied, extremely well. There was no compliment in it, just fact. Grace felt something cold brush against her spine. Why are you here? Daniel closed the folder. Because we need to understand your involvement. Involvement, her voice sharpened. I'm a tailor. And yet, the younger lawyer interjected, you altered an item central to an ongoing investigation without documentation, invoice, or authorization. Grace's breath caught. She had expected suspicion, maybe even arrogance. But this felt like an accusation dressed up as professionalism. I didn't alter it, she said. I repaired it. The third man studied her carefully. That distinction may not matter. For the first time, Grace felt fear bloom fully in her chest. Not panic, not hysteria. The slow, sinking fear of realizing you are standing alone in a room where the rules were written without you in mind. You're saying I did something wrong, she said. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked around again, taking in the shop, the neighborhood beyond the window, the woman standing in front of him. We're saying, he replied carefully, that your actions may have legal implications. The word legal hung in the air like a threat disguised as vocabulary. Grace swallowed. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't steal anything. I didn't ask for money. No, Daniel said, you didn't. And somehow that made it worse. The younger lawyer slid a document across the counter. It was dense, paragraphs, clauses, language meant to confuse more than clarify. What is this? Grace asked. A statement, Daniel replied. We need you to sign it. Her eyes skimmed the page. Words jumped out at her. Liability, non-disclosure, cooperation. She pushed it back. I don't sign things I don't understand. The third man's lips twitched, almost impressed. That's wise, he said, but refusing to cooperate could escalate the situation. There it was, the quiet threat. No raised voices, no handcuffs, just the implication that resistance had consequences. Grace leaned back against the counter. For a moment, she saw herself from the outside. A poor black woman in a shrinking neighborhood, surrounded by men whose shoes cost more than her monthly rent. She thought of her father, of how many times he'd been asked to prove his innocence before anyone considered his worth. I fixed a suit, she said again, slower now. Because that's my job, because it was damaged on purpose, and because charging him wouldn't have meant anything. Daniel tilted his head. Why didn't you charge him? The question caught her off guard. Because, she said after a beat, my work has value whether money changes hands or not. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Evaluative silence. The men exchanged another glance, this one longer. The third man finally spoke. Do you still have the discarded fabric? Grace hesitated. Yes. Where? She turned, opening a drawer beneath the counter. Inside were small labeled envelopes, thread samples, fabric scraps, pieces she kept out of habit, out of respect for her process. She handed one over. The man took it carefully, like it might bite. This, he said, holding it up, may be the only untouched evidence left. Grace felt her knees weaken. You mean, she whispered, me fixing the suit ruined your case? Daniel looked at her steadily. No. He paused. It may have saved it. The room seemed to tilt. Saved it. Before Grace could respond, the bell above the door rang. Her landlord stepped inside. He took one look at the men in suits, then at Grace and smiled. Well, he said lightly, this looks serious. Grace's heart sank. Because now it wasn't just about a suit. It was about who would control the story next. And Grace could already feel the system tightening around her, ready to decide whether her kindness made her a hero or a liability. The landlord's smile didn't reach his eyes. He stood just inside the doorway, hands tucked into his coat pockets, pretending curiosity while quietly enjoying the imbalance of power unfolding in his favor. Grace knew that look. She'd seen it every time rent was late, every time a new notice appeared under her door. It was the look of someone waiting for you to fail so they could call it business. Daniel Roth turned slowly to face him. And you are? Mark Feldman, the landlord replied easily. I own the building. Grace felt her jaw tighten. Of course he had shown up now, like pressure drawn to weakness. We're in the middle of a private conversation, Daniel said. Mark raised his hands in mock surrender. Of course, I was just opening the shop for the day like usual. He glanced at Grace. Everything okay here? Grace didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat felt sealed shut. The third lawyer, the quiet one, watched the exchange with sharp interest. He was the only one who hadn't dismissed Grace as an inconvenience yet. His eyes flicked from Mark to the eviction notices still visible beneath the counter. You've been trying to remove her, he said calmly. Mark laughed a short, rehearsed sound. I'm a landlord, she's a tenant, it's not personal. Grace finally spoke. You raised the rent 3 times in 1 year. Mark shrugged. Market rates. Daniel closed the leather folder slowly. The sound was deliberate, final. Mr. Feldman, I'm going to ask you to step outside. Mark blinked. Excuse me. This conversation doesn't concern you, Daniel repeated. Yet. The word lingered. Mark hesitated, then forced another smile. I'll be right outside if you need anything. He stepped back out, but not before giving Grace a look that promised this wasn't over. The door closed. The shop felt heavier. Grace exhaled shakily. You see what I deal with. Daniel studied her for a moment. Yes, we do. The younger lawyer checked his tablet again. We've reviewed preliminary footage from the gala last night. Mr. Hale wore the suit you repaired. Grace nodded. I assumed he would. He gave a speech, the lawyer continued. Announced a pending acquisition, one that would have collapsed if the sabotage had been discovered earlier. Grace's stomach dropped. You mean, she said slowly, someone wanted him embarrassed or exposed. Or discredited, the third man added. The tier was placed strategically. It would have worsened under stress, public failure. Grace closed her eyes briefly. She could picture it now, the fabric ripping further, the whispers, the cameras, the headlines. She had prevented all of it without ever knowing. I didn't know, she repeated, softer this time. We believe you, Daniel said. That surprised her. Then why does it feel like I'm on trial, she asked. The men exchanged another look, this one tinged with something closer to honesty. Because, Daniel said, good intentions don't protect you when powerful people start losing money. The words landed hard. The third man stepped forward. Your repair technique, he said, was unusual. Grace frowned. Unusual how? You didn't simply patch the tier, he explained. You reinforced the surrounding structure, changed stress points. That tells us something. That the damage wasn't accidental, Grace said automatically. Yes, he replied, and that you understood that instinctively. Grace swallowed. My father taught me to listen to fabric. Damage tells a story if you let it. For the first time, something shifted in the room. Respect, real, unspoken respect. That instinct, Daniel said, is why we're here, not to accuse you, but to ensure you're protected. Grace let out a humorless laugh. Protected from who? Daniel didn't hesitate. From the people who did this. Silence stretched between them. You're saying, Grace began carefully, that someone powerful enough to sabotage a billionaire might come after a Tailor. The younger lawyer looked uncomfortable. The third man didn't. Truth travels, he said. even when you try to hide it in thread. Grace felt the weight of that settle into her chest. Daniel slid a different document across the counter this time. Thinner, cleaner. "This isn't a statement," he said. "It's legal representation." Grace stared at it. "I can't afford lawyers." "You don't have to," Daniel replied. "Mr. Hale insists." Her eyes snapped up. "Why?" Daniel's voice softened. "Because you didn't have to fix that suit, and because you didn't take advantage of him when you could have." Grace shook her head. "That shouldn't make me special." The third man met her gaze. "In this world, it does." A knock came at the door again. Grace's pulse spiked, but this time it was Mark. It was a woman from the neighborhood. Mrs. Jenkins, elderly, sharp-eyed. She peeked inside nervously. "Grace," she said, "there are people talking outside, cameras." "Cameras?" Grace's heart began to race. Daniel cursed under his breath. That was fast. "Media?" Grace asked. "Word spreads," the younger lawyer said. "A billionaire, lawyers, a poor neighborhood, it doesn't take much." Grace looked toward the window. Shapes moved beyond the glass now. Phones raised, curiosity turning into narrative. "I never wanted attention," she whispered. Daniel leaned in. "Then listen to me carefully. From this moment on, everything you say matters, everything you've done matters, and everything they think they know about you will be wrong." Grace straightened. Her fear was still there, but beneath it, something steadier began to rise. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Stand straight. Let your work speak." "I won't lie," she said. "I won't hide, and I won't apologize for fixing something broken." The third man smiled faintly. "Good, because they were counting on you doing exactly that." Outside, voices grew louder. The quiet anonymity Grace had lived in for decades was evaporating by the second. Daniel gathered the documents. "We'll handle the legal storm, but understand this, once the truth comes out, it won't just expose sabotage." He paused. "It will expose how quickly people assume guilt when kindness comes from someone they underestimate." Grace nodded slowly. She looked around her shop one last time. The cracked floors, the old machines, the photographs on the wall. This place had always been small, but today it had become dangerous. Not because of what she had done wrong, but because of what she had done right. And as the door opened to the noise outside, Grace stepped forward. Knowing the confrontation that began with a torn suit had now turned her quiet life into a battleground she never asked for, but would not run from. By the end of that morning, Grace Thompson's shop was no longer just a tailor's shop. It was a story. Cameras crowded the sidewalk like vultures circling something wounded. Microphones hovered in the air. People who had never stepped foot in her neighborhood suddenly knew its name, knew her face, knew just enough to be dangerous. A poor tailor and a billionaire. A mysterious free repair. Lawyers swarmed small black-owned business. None of them knew the truth yet, but they didn't need it. Speculation was louder. Grace stood just inside the doorway, watching the chaos through the glass. Every instinct in her told her to retreat, to turn off the lights and disappear the way she always had when the world got too loud. But Daniel Roth stood beside her now, calm and immovable, like a wall she hadn't known she was allowed to lean on. "You don't have to speak," he said quietly. "Not yet." Grace nodded, though her heart beat so hard she could feel it in her throat. Across the street she spotted familiar faces. Neighbors, some looked proud, some looked afraid. A few looked resentful, like her trouble might splash onto them. Grace understood all of it. When survival is fragile, attention feels like danger. The shop door closed behind them, shutting out the noise. Inside, the silence felt different now, not lonely, but tense. The younger lawyer set his tablet down on the counter, pulling up documents and images Grace didn't fully understand. "The suit," he said, turning the screen toward her, "wasn't the only thing sabotaged." Grace leaned closer. Graphs, timelines, names she'd never heard of. "Someone inside Mr. Hale's company has been undermining him for months," Daniel explained. "Leaking information, manipulating stock, setting him up to fail publicly so they could profit quietly." "And my shop got caught in the middle," Grace said. "Yes," Daniel replied, "because sabotage needs a final trigger. The suit was meant to humiliate him in front of investors. You removed that trigger." Grace let that sink in. All her life, she'd been told her work was small, local, insignificant, and yet something she had done with thread and patience had disrupted a plan built with millions of dollars and cold intention. That's why they'll come after the weakest link, the third man said. Grace looked at him, me. He didn't deny it. They won't start with lawsuits, he continued. They'll start with narratives. Grace frowned, narratives. They'll question your motive, Daniel said. Suggest you were paid under the table, that you tampered with evidence deliberately, that you're not as innocent as you appear. Grace felt anger spark for the first time, not fear, anger. Because I'm poor, she said flatly, and black and alone. The room didn't argue. Daniel met her eyes, yes. The truth of it sat heavy, but Grace didn't look away. She had lived inside that truth her whole life. This time, she just wasn't pretending it didn't exist. A knock came at the back door. Grace stiffened again, but Daniel checked through the window before opening it. A uniformed police officer stood there, expression neutral. Just a welfare check, the officer said. Heard there was a disturbance. Grace felt her shoulders tense. She had done nothing wrong, yet her body reacted as if guilt were assumed by default. Daniel stepped forward smoothly. There's no disturbance, just a business meeting. The officer glanced at Grace. Ma'am. Grace met his gaze steadily. Everything's fine. The officer nodded, lingering a moment longer than necessary, then left. When the door shut, Grace exhaled slowly. That, the third man said, was the first test. Grace rubbed her palms together, and I passed. For now, he replied. The lawyers left shortly after, advising Grace to close the shop early and avoid public interaction. Daniel promised to return later with updates. As the door shut behind them, the weight of the day finally crashed down on her. Grace locked the door. The shop fell quiet again, but not peacefully. Her mind replayed everything. The cameras, the accusations, the way her landlord had smiled when he thought trouble would swallow her. She sank onto the stool behind the counter. For years, Grace had survived by staying invisible, by keeping her head down, by believing dignity meant endurance. Now she was being asked to stand in the light. And light, she knew, revealed everything, flaws included. Her phone buzzed. She stared at it like it might bite her. The number was unfamiliar. Hello, she answered cautiously. Grace Thompson, a woman's voice asked, professional, polite. Yes. This is Karen Mills from Hale Industries. Mr. Hale would like to speak with you. Grace's breath caught. The billionaire, she asked. Yes, Karen replied, at your convenience. Grace looked around her shop, the place that had suddenly become a battleground, and nodded, even though Karen couldn't see her. Tell him, Grace said, steadying herself, he can come here. There was a pause on the other end. Are you sure? Grace glanced at her father's photograph on the wall. His eyes seemed to watch her, calm and unwavering. Yes, she said, this is where it started. An hour later, the street quieted again. The cameras left in search of newer drama. Grace brewed a pot of coffee she barely tasted and waited. When Jonathan Hale arrived, he came alone. No entourage, no lawyers, no arrogance. He stepped into the shop slowly, taking it in with a seriousness she hadn't seen the first time. This time he looked unsettled. You didn't have to come, Grace said. I did, he replied, because this is my mess. They stood across from each other, two people from opposite ends of a brutal system, bound together by a torn suit and an act neither fully understood when it happened. I owe you an apology, Hale said. Grace raised an eyebrow. For what? For assuming your kindness was simple, he answered, for not asking why. Grace folded her arms, and now you know. I'm starting to, he said. You fixed something I didn't even know was broken. Grace studied him carefully. Power still clung to him, but so did discomfort. They're going to try to bury this, Hale continued. Quietly, they'll sacrifice a few names and protect the rest. And me, Grace asked. Hale hesitated. That depends, he said, on whether you're willing to be visible. Grace felt the familiar fear rise again, but this time it didn't control her. I've been invisible my whole life, she said softly, and it didn't protect me then. Hale nodded. Then we do this the right way. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the shop floor. Grace knew this was only the beginning. The pressure would rise, the stories would twist, the system would test her endurance in ways she'd never imagined. But for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. And that changed everything. That night, Grace did not sleep. She lay on the narrow couch in the back of the shop, staring at the ceiling where a water stain had slowly spread over the years like a map of places she never got to visit. Every sound outside felt amplified. A car passing, a voice laughing too loudly, a siren in the distance that never quite came close, yet always felt like it could. Being seen had a cost. Grace was learning that fast. By morning, the story had grown legs. Headlines didn't call her Grace Thompson. They called her the Tailor. They didn't say skilled. They said poor. They didn't say kindness. They said suspicious generosity. Every word bent slightly away from truth, not enough to be obvious, but enough to shift blame if needed. Grace unlocked the shop with cameras already waiting again. A reporter stepped forward, microphone extended, voice sweet and sharp at the same time. Grace, did you know the suit you repaired was linked to a corporate scandal? Grace paused. She remembered Daniel's words. Everything you say matters. I knew it was damaged, she said evenly. That's my job. Another voice cut in. Were you compensated in any way? No. Then why fix it for free? Grace looked directly into the camera. Because my work deserves respect whether I'm paid or not. That clip would replay for days. Some would call it powerful, others would call it arrogant. Grace understood then that truth never belonged to the speaker once it left their mouth. Inside the shop, business slowed to nothing. Loyal customers stayed away, afraid of being seen. New faces appeared only to take photos. The landlord sent another notice, this one less polite than the last. Mark Feldman was done pretending patience. By noon, Daniel returned, his expression tight. They're leaking selectively, he said, trying to frame this as an unfortunate misunderstanding resolved quietly. Grace folded fabric on the counter with slow precision. Quietly for who? For everyone except you. The third lawyer arrived shortly after, carrying a thin folder. We traced the sabotage further, he said. The thread used to weaken the suit was industrial grade, rare, expensive, not something a tailor would normally have access to. Grace looked up. So they'll say I did it. They'll suggest it, he replied. They won't accuse you directly, not yet. That afternoon, Grace received her first anonymous message. No name, no number. People like you should stay in their lane. She deleted it without replying, but her hands shook afterward. Jonathan Hale called again that evening. This time his voice carried strain. My board wants this over, he admitted. They want me to distance myself from you. Grace wasn't surprised. And will you? Hale hesitated. No. That answer mattered more than anything else he could have said. The next day brought escalation. An audit notice arrived, then a health inspection, then a zoning complaint questioning whether her shop was compliant with updated regulations she'd never been notified about. Each visit was polite. Each one chipped away at her ability to function. Grace felt herself shrinking under the weight of it, not because she was weak, but because exhaustion is cumulative. Strength erodes quietly. One evening after the inspectors left, Grace sat alone on the shop floor back against the counter. The lights were off. The city glowed through the window, uncaring. She allowed herself a moment of honesty. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered to her father's photograph. The door opened softly. Mrs. Jenkins stepped inside, carrying a bag. I brought you food, she said. You've been forgetting to eat. Grace stood, embarrassed by the tears she hadn't realized were there. You shouldn't be here, Grace said. People are watching. Mrs. Jenkins snorted. They always have been, you just see it now. She set the bag on the counter. You fixed my husband's suit once, for free, for his funeral. You never told anyone. Grace swallowed hard. Kindness doesn't make noise, Mrs. Jenkins continued, but it echoes. Over the next few days, something unexpected happened. People came back. Not reporters, not tourists. Neighbors. A bus driver whose uniform Grace had altered years ago. A teacher who remembered her father. A young man who needed a suit for an interview and had only enough money for groceries. They didn't ask questions. They didn't bring cameras. They brought trust. Each small interaction fortified Grace in ways no legal strategy could. She realized then that while systems attack vertically, community defends horizontally. Daniel noticed it too. They underestimated this, he said one afternoon, watching customers leave with quiet nods of gratitude. They always do, Grace replied. The real blow came a week later. A formal notice accused Grace of tampering with evidence. Not a charge, not yet, but enough to stain. The language was careful, hypothetical, suggestive. Grace read it twice, then folded it neatly. They're testing how far they can push, Daniel said. Grace looked at him, her voice steady but tired. And if they push further? Then, Daniel replied, we stop playing defense. Jonathan Hale requested a meeting, not privately, publicly. A press conference. Grace felt fear spike again. This was the point of no return. They'll tear you apart, she said to Hale over the phone. They already are, he replied. Might as well tell the truth while they're watching. The day of the conference, Grace stood backstage, hands clasped tightly. The noise beyond the curtain was deafening. She thought of the girl she'd once been, stitching beside her father, believing skill would protect her. It hadn't, but honesty might. When they stepped out, flashes exploded. Hale spoke first, detailing the sabotage, the internal corruption, the evidence Grace unknowingly preserved. Then he did something no one expected. He stepped aside. Grace walked to the podium. She didn't speak loudly, she didn't perform. She spoke plainly. I didn't fix a suit to make a statement, she said. I fixed it because it was broken, because that's what I do. If that makes me suspicious, then maybe we should ask why kindness is so hard to believe when it comes from someone like me. Silence followed. Not the empty kind. The listening kind. Grace stepped back, heart pounding, knowing the rising action of her life had reached a point where retreat was impossible. The truth was out now. And whatever came next, justice or backlash, she would meet it standing, not hiding. Because the cost of being seen was high. But the cost of staying invisible had been higher all along. The silence after Grace stepped away from the podium was heavier than the noise that had come before it. For a brief moment, the world seemed unsure how to react to a poor black tailor refusing to shrink. Then the questions came. They flew fast, sharp, layered with disbelief. Ms. Thompson, are you accusing Hale Industries of corruption? Did you knowingly interfere with evidence? Were you promised anything in return for your silence? Grace stood still, hands clasped in front of her, her face calm in a way that surprised even herself. This wasn't composure born from confidence. It was composure born from exhaustion, the kind that leaves no room for fear because there's nothing left to protect. Jonathan Hale stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the chaos. This ends now, he said. The room quieted. For weeks, Hale continued, my company has allowed a false narrative to grow, one that places suspicion on the least powerful person in this story instead of the most convenient targets. He turned slightly toward Grace. Ms. Thompson didn't sabotage anything. She repaired it, and in doing so, she preserved the only remaining physical evidence that exposed internal fraud. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniel Roth stood at the edge of the stage, watching carefully. He knew what was coming next would either collapse the system or provoke it. Hale gestured toward a large screen behind them. Images appeared. Documents, emails, transaction records, internal memos dated weeks before the gala. Names surfaced, executives, consultants, board advisors, people the public trusted. Grace felt her breath catch. She hadn't known the scale. The third lawyer stepped forward now, no longer hiding in the background. The sabotage of Mr. Hale's suit was the final move in a coordinated effort to discredit him publicly, he said. The plan relied on humiliation, not destruction, a ripped suit, a viral moment, a collapse in confidence. He paused, but Ms. Thompson's repair altered the stress distribution of the fabric. That change revealed intentional weakening rather than accidental damage. The room erupted. Voices overlapped, cameras flashed, Reporters leaned forward like predators sensing blood. Grace felt dizzy. All she had done was sew. And yet the room was shifting because of her. A reporter shouted, "Ms. Thompson, why keep the fabric scraps?" Grace stepped forward again, her voice steady but raw. "Because my father taught me that nothing breaks without leaving a reason behind," she said. "And because people like me don't get second chances if we throw evidence away." That line would be quoted everywhere. Across town, in boardrooms and private offices, phones buzzed. Meetings were canceled, flights rerouted. Lawyers called other lawyers. The system recognized danger when it saw it. And it was coming from someone it had never prepared for. Within hours, warrants were issued. 2 executives were escorted out of Hale Industries' headquarters under quiet supervision. Another resigned before sunrise. Stock prices dipped, then stabilized as the truth solidified. But the real confrontation wasn't happening in public. It was happening in Grace's shop. That evening, Mark Feldman walked in unannounced. No smile this time. "You've caused a lot of trouble," he said. Grace looked up from the counter. "I didn't cause anything, I fixed something broken." Mark laughed bitterly. "You think that matters? You think they'll remember you once this is over?" Grace studied him carefully. The power he once held over her now looked thin, temporary. "They already have," she said. Mark's jaw tightened. "Your lease is paid," Grace interrupted, "in full and renegotiated." Mark froze. Daniel stepped out from the back room. "Hale Industries purchased the building this afternoon. Your involvement ends today." For the first time, Mark looked small. "This isn't charity," Grace added. "It's accountability." Mark left without another word. Grace leaned against the counter, legs shaking, not from fear but from release. A weight she'd carried for years slipped off her shoulders quietly. The climax, however, hadn't finished climbing. A week later, Grace was summoned, not requested, to testify. Not in a courtroom filled with jurors, but in a closed congressional inquiry investigating corporate manipulation and whistleblower suppression. Grace sat at the long table, hands folded, surrounded by men and women in tailored authority. Microphones waited, screens glowed. One man leaned forward. "Ms. Thompson, do you consider yourself a whistleblower?" Grace considered the word carefully. "No," she said, "I consider myself a professional." A ripple of confusion passed through the room. "I didn't expose corruption on purpose," she continued. "I didn't plan to challenge anyone. I did my job well, and when people noticed, they tried to turn that into something suspicious." She met their eyes one by one. "That's the part worth investigating." Silence followed. Not dismissal. Recognition. By the time the inquiry concluded, the narrative had fully shifted. Grace was no longer the poor tailor involved in a scandal. She was the woman whose integrity had exposed it. Jonathan Hale faced his own reckoning publicly. He admitted what he'd ignored, apologized for what his company enabled, promised structural changes that couldn't be hidden behind press releases. Grace didn't stand beside him on stage this time. She watched from the back. Her role was finished. Or so she thought. A young reporter approached her afterward, nervous, respectful. "Ms. Thompson," she said, "what happens next for you?" Grace smiled faintly. "Tomorrow I open my shop." The reporter blinked. "That's it." Grace nodded. "That's enough." The climax of Grace's story wasn't the arrests. It wasn't the headlines. It was the moment the system tried to crush her, and failed because it underestimated the weight of quiet dignity. And as the cameras finally turned away, the most powerful image of all remained unseen by the world. A tailor returning to a craft. Not as a symbol, not as a scandal, but as a woman who stood in the center of a storm and didn't move. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it's stitched together slowly, by hands the world never thought to fear. The morning after the hearings ended, Grace Thompson opened her shop the same way she always had. She arrived before sunrise, lifted the metal shutter with both hands, let the bell above the door ring once, soft and familiar. The street looked unchanged, same cracked pavement, same early buses hissing to a stop, but something in the air felt lighter, as if the weight that had pressed down on the block for years had finally shifted. Inside, the shop smelled like coffee and fabric and oil from the old machines. Grace stood still for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. No cameras, no lawyers, no microphones, just space. This was what she had fought for without realizing it. She set her bag down behind the counter and ran her fingers across the wood. The surface bore small scratches from decades of use, her father's hands, then hers, proof that something had endured. By mid-morning, customers began to arrive. Not crowds, not spectacle. People. Mrs. Jenkins came first, leaning on her cane, smiling like she always had. A young woman followed, clutching a blazer she needed altered for her first real job interview. A man from down the block brought in a coat he'd been meaning to fix for years but never trusted anyone else with. They didn't mention the news, they didn't ask questions. They just trusted her. Grace worked steadily, her movements smooth and unhurried. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders weren't tense. The machines didn't seem as loud, the walls didn't feel like they were closing in. At noon, Daniel Roth stopped by. No briefcase this time, no suit jacket, just a man who looked tired in a human way. "I wanted to check in," he said. Grace nodded toward a chair. "Sit, you look like you need it." Daniel smiled faintly and sat. "You okay?" Grace thought about it honestly. "I am." Daniel glanced around the shop. "This place survived." "Yes," she said, "it did." They sat in silence for a moment. "You know," Daniel said carefully, "there will be offers." Grace raised an eyebrow. "There already are. Partnerships, endorsements, interviews, a documentary proposal she hadn't even opened yet." And Daniel asked. "And I'm not saying yes to everything," Grace replied. "Visibility should be chosen, not forced." Daniel nodded. "That's wise." Jonathan Hale came later that afternoon. This time, he didn't stand at the door uncertainly. He walked in like someone entering a space they finally understood didn't belong to them. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply. Grace looked up from her work. "You already did." Hale shook his head. "Not properly." He glanced around. "This shop, it's the reason everything changed." Grace met his gaze. "No, it's just where the truth couldn't hide." Hale took a breath. "We're setting up a fund, independent, for tradespeople, tailors, craftsmen, people whose work keeps things standing but never gets credit." Grace considered this. "Make sure it doesn't come with strings." "It won't," he promised. She nodded. "Then it might matter." Hale hesitated before speaking again. "Your landlord." "I know," Grace said. "The building changed hands." "And you're staying." Grace smiled. "I never planned on leaving." When Hale left, the shop felt quieter but not empty. That evening, Grace closed early. She turned the sign to closed, locked the door, and sat beneath her father's photograph. For the first time since he died, she spoke to him without grief tightening her chest. "You were right," she said softly. "The work speaks." She remembered how invisible he had been in life, how rarely anyone had said his name with respect. And yet, here she was, standing in the echo of his lessons, watched by a world that had finally learned to listen. In the weeks that followed, life didn't become perfect. The shop still needed repairs, some machines still sputtered, Grace still counted expenses carefully. But now, when challenges came, they didn't come wrapped in quiet dismissal. People returned her calls. Banks listened. And when they didn't, she walked away without doubting her worth. One afternoon, a local school invited her to speak to a group of students learning trades. Grace stood at the front of the room, nervous in a way she hadn't expected. "I'm not here to motivate you," she said honestly. "I'm here to tell you the truth." The students leaned in. "You will be underestimated," she continued. "Especially if your work happens quietly, especially if you don't look like what people expect success to look like." She paused. "But that doesn't make your work small." That line stayed with them. Back at the shop, Grace noticed something else changing. She wasn't alone anymore. Young apprentices asked to learn from her, not because she was famous, but because she was steady. She chose to, taught them the way her father taught her, slowly, carefully, with respect. The shop became louder, warmer, alive. One evening after closing, Grace stepped outside and looked down the street. Lights glowed in windows that once felt dark. Neighbors laughed. Someone played music softly from an open door. The neighborhood wasn't saved, but it was still standing. And so was she. Grace thought back to the moment she'd fixed the suit for free, how small it had felt, how ordinary. She understood now that dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It waits, and when the world finally stumbles into it, dignity doesn't flinch. Grace locked the door and headed home, the bell ringing once behind her. Not as an ending, but as a continuation. Because some stories don't end with applause. They end with a woman returning to her work. Stronger, seen, and no longer asking permission to exist. Some people believe power only lives in money, titles, or loud voices. This story reminds us how wrong that belief is. Grace Thompson didn't change the world by chasing attention. She didn't expose corruption by trying to be brave. She didn't win because she was protected, wealthy, or connected. She won because she refused to abandon her dignity when it would have been easier and safer to do so. The system expected her to be invisible, expected her kindness to be suspicious, expected her skill to be replaceable. And when she didn't behave the way they expected, the system panicked. That's the truth most people don't want to admit. Injustice survives not because it's strong, but because it assumes the powerless will stay quiet. It assumes poor hands won't hold evidence. It assumes kindness won't fight back. Grace proved something dangerous to that belief. She showed that doing honest work with integrity can disrupt lies built with millions of dollars. She showed that dignity is not weakness, it is evidence. And she showed that when people underestimate you, they often hand you the space to reveal the truth. This isn't a story about a billionaire saving a tailor. It's a story about a tailor saving herself by refusing to let the world decide her value. If there's one lesson to carry forward, it's this. Never let a system convince you that your quiet work doesn't matter. Never believe that kindness makes you small. And never apologize for standing firm in who you are, even when the world questions you. Because sometimes the most powerful resistance doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't perform. Sometimes it simply does the work. With honesty, with skill, and with dignity. And when that happens, even the loudest systems are forced to listen. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember that their integrity still matters.